So I'm Michelle. I'm the principal and founder of leanRAQA. Some of you might know me from LinkedIn and be familiar with my executive team here. It's important to understand the historical timeline of how the QSR and the 13485 standard has evolved in parallel to 14971. So we have QSR that was published in 1996 to update the original good manufacturing practices from 1978. And since 1996, the QSR has remained largely unchanged until this past February, at which point it became the QMSR. Whereas 13485 was initially introduced in 1996, around the same time as the QSR, but it's been updated at least twice in the interim between the QMSR publication. So that harmonization has been working towards coming together for quite some time. And then in parallel, ISO 14971 has been developed, released, and then updated a subsequent number of times. So if we look at more around the context of the QSR, next slide. The reason that it had not been really changed or updated in a period of time is not only because the QSR an actual regulation as opposed to just a recognized standard, but they had what they called the preamble, which was the original set of comments that they published, an industry comment followed by the FDA regulation that communicated their expectation over how they were interpreting that particular comment or concern in context of the QSR. Even though it was not codified, FDA continually made reference to this preamble around what their expectations for QSR implementation were. So really the FDA was posturing to say, we've been waiting for 13485 and participating in the technical committee to get 13485 to evolve to the point that it met our expectations in that preamble. Next slide. So if we look at what the quality management system regulation consists of, what is codified is two parts. It's ISO 13485, and then it's the definitions or clause 3 from ISO 9001. And these two parts are what make up the core of the quality management system regulation. However, it gets a little bit more complex. Next slide. Because now we have another set of regulation versus expectation. In the comments to the QMSR that was just released, the FDA specifically says, while we're not codifying 14971 or the notes to ISO 13485, if you want to know when we say the word risk or when we're talking about a particular clause, you need to know and understand both ISO 1471 and the notes. So even though they're not codified, they communicate the FDA's expectation in these areas. Next slide, please. So the circle continues if we're trying to understand how the FDA is going to interpret and expect the implementation of the QSR. We've got the core that's codified. We have the notes and the 14971 that they particularly say these are our expectations. The 13485 has a practical guide, which is a 200-page guide to help you interpret the 20-page standard. And now the comments to the QMSR have become the new preamble. And oh, by the way, they make up about 90 pages of a 100-page document. And then you've got, amongst all of this, trying to understand except for, so those key areas where they're still not the same despite all of these context. Next slide, please. So what is all this going to mean for the MDSAP audit model and the potential of people being interested in the Canadian market? Next slide. Well, let's take a look at what the 5 key differences between the QMSR and the ISO 13485. Next slide. The first and most extensive difference for people who have the ISO 13485 but might not be compliant with the QMSR is that there are some significant impacts to the definitions that the FDA has chosen to keep. These are just a couple of the bigger ones that are going to impact not just your definitions, but the procedures and the way you go about implementing them. These are label and labeling, customer, and correction. And we'll dive into a few more of these in a second. Next slide. So labeling and packaging is the big one in terms of the FDA has added a clause for the requirements for the UDI and for the way you maintain records around the labeling and packaging, and also the timing in which labeling inspection is expected to happen. Next slide. So UDI requirements, the FDA is going to maintain their traceability requirements per Part 830 of the 21 CFR, in addition to the record requirements that they're adding for labeling pertinent to UDI. Next. So signature and date requirements, FDA has long-standing requirements for electronic records and signatures under 21 CFR Part 11. Those are still required, and all your documents and records must bear a signature and date that complies with Part 11. Next slide. So reporting and correction, for reporting activities, you need to be compliant with 21 CFR 803 for medical device reporting. And so your procedures need to be updated to make sure they include that. But one interesting definition change that the FDA said is not only are we recognizing the term correction in terms of field corrections that you may take on product that's left your distribution, but we're also recognizing that the term correction could fall within your corrective and preventive action procedure as an internal correction to product that you might have reworked underneath a material review board or nonconformance inside your control. So you need to be mindful when you talk about the word correction in your corrective and preventive actions that you're very clear about, are these internal or external corrections? Next slide. So what does this imply for the MDSAP audit model? Well, are the tasks going to be subject to change? Well, some will remain the same, where in these 5 key areas, they didn't come to full harmonization. For instance, this task pertinent to the UDI and record keeping might say the same or have small modifications to reflect the QMSR. Next slide. Where other tasks where the FDA significantly harmonized with ISO 13485, these tasks are likely to go away in the MDSAP audit model. For instance, like the reference to the medical device record that the FDA now considers similar to the medical device file. Next slide. So all this means that MDSAP might be more attractive as a market strategy than it has been in the past due to cost limitations. It is an opportunity to optimize multiple audits, but in the past, the QSR was, I don't want to necessarily say easier to comply with, but it had less specific requirements for the number and the type and the content of procedures. And so you had a little bit more flexibility in how you implemented it. Well, now that a lot of that flexibility and a lot of the privacy that you got with different types of records is removed underneath the QMSR. So if you're doing all of that work to maintain that quality management system, and you can keep both the US and other markets open and maybe minimize audits, all of that is factors to consider. In addition, the FDA and Health Canada is looking at, further harmonization towards the eStar program for submissions. So all of these are going to be a little bit more of a weight in the go-to-market strategy. Next slide. So there are still more than a handful worth of burning questions related to the QMSR and how it's going to be implemented. Next slide. For instance, will FDA accept ISO certifications in lieu of audits? And no, they will not accept ISO 13485 certificates. They will not accept MDSAP certificates. What they will do is they will continue to, underneath their current MDSAP program, where they accept the audit report and they audit the audit report. And that will only do in-law for the general inspections that you come up in the normal workflow. This will not get you out of any other type of cause of FDA inspection. Next slide. So the intended timeline for implementation is 2 years after the publication. So QMSR is going to be required in February of 2026. At that time, it will be retired on its 50th birthday. Next slide. So what about QSIT, or the Quality System Audit Inspection Technique? The FDA has not published or indicated what their new inspection technique will be to replace QSIT, but it's highly likely that they intend to adopt something similar to MDSAP, if not MDSAP itself. But the FDA will not be issuing QMSR compliance certificates for this if you choose to stay underneath the FDA inspection model. Next slide. So what happens if ISO 13485 is revised? So now that the FDA is in corporate ISO, but they would have to evaluate the changes and whether or not those should be incorporated into the QMSR. Because again, even the QMSR is a regulation that has chosen to likely recognize ISO. So what does that mean? It means your future timelines could very well, we just came together in harmonization, but future edits to or revisions to ISO 13485, we could lose that harmonization in the future. And then all along, we still have the context of the expectation of 14971 running in parallel. Next slide. So I do have a cheat sheet that's particularly helpful. Again, if you're moving from QMSR to ISO 1345, you will have even more to do than these 5 key areas. So shoot us an email and we're happy to get you that resource. Next slide. And then I do have a full hour presentation available that you can get by clicking the link here for this QMSR masterclass if you want to understand more in depth about the history and the changes. Next slide. And then that's all. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was helpful.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Simplicio. I'm the Regulatory Affairs and Quality Manager for Advanced Sterilization Products. I'm also a member of Medtech Canada's Regulatory and Quality Affairs Education Committee. It is my pleasure today to moderate this session. You can now open up your Slido and type in your questions or upvote questions from others. For those that are in person, please feel free to make your way over to the question mics. Just making sure this was on. So while we wait for some questions to come in, I do have some pre-prepared questions. So I'll start with Morgan. And here's another mic. Okay. What is the timeline for obtaining an MDSAP certificate?
So the timeline for obtaining an MDSAP certificate is still a rather lengthy one. I did try to sample and pool the auditing organizations as a whole so I could speak on not just behalf of BSI, but 6 to 12 months is where most of us are averaging that. The process does include application, actually finding auditors that can audit your company. We do have technical qualifications based on auditor experience that we have to assign. So depending on how rare a device you might have, it might be a little bit lengthier of a process. If it's something more simple or common, some of those general medical devices, then we might have more readily available auditors. It does also impact where globally your locations are and the size of those multiple facilities. So it could be anywhere from 6 to 12 plus months to obtain an MDSAP certification. So don't just come in thinking you're going to get one next month when you submit your application.
And maybe I can just add to that, because when we assess the AOs, we see the back office. And certainly I think what industry needs to understand is they are scheduling audits 3 to 6 months ahead. Mm-hmm. They have to book their auditors, and their auditors are busy. And so if you get a date and it's 3 months from now, that's good. That's a good date. That's a good date, right? And if you can't make that, or if you have to change it, then it may be
3 more months
exactly.
before you get another.
So that is one of the big aspects of it to keep in mind. It's really challenging. I've seen how they schedule. It's very challenging to move all the different parts with the technical competence, the different jurisdictions and everything. It's very, very challenging on their side to do.
Thank you. I think I see some questions coming in from Slido, so I'll start with the first one. Health Canada gave their perspective on how they expect to see the scope on the MDSAP certs. They prefer specific terminology. Our registrar, BSI, has advised us to use broader terminology. Could you comment on the difference in opinion on scope? What do the regulators ask of the registrars?
This, I have to say, is something that we've been, I don't want to say struggling, but this has been a recurring issue since we started using certificates in 2003. It's always been really challenging to find the right balance of precise enough so that someone reviewing the file can say, yes, this device is specifically captured in this certification, but not so precise that, it's down to like the submodel. It's an ongoing issue, and we've provided various guidance over the years to the EAOs. I think one of the things that's interesting that we're working on now, I didn't mention it earlier because it's still, I don't want to say there's a negotiation, but there's a lot of back office work that needs to be done. But we're looking at introducing the use of GMDM coding for scopes at a higher level, nonetheless, to make it much more easier to positively identify these products and scopes. We have considerations of course, the regulators have to be able to use that where appropriate. We also have to think about what it means for manufacturers in terms of being able to access the GMDM codes for their products as well. That's another consideration. But that's something we've been looking at trying to fix because we recognize that it's a bit of an irritant when you submit an application and your AO said, yeah, this should be fine. And then we look at it and say, no. Right? It doesn't happen as much anymore. I mean, last week we did get a scope that was basically the way it was written. We were like, this covers everything. It was like, it included non-invasive and invasive devices and non-active and active devices. And we're like, well, this is everything. This is everything. Like, this is not helpful. So those are few and far between. Generally, what we get is quite close. And in some cases, it happens occasionally. You say, well, you know what? This could be a bit better. When it gets revised, get it fixed, but we understand what the situation is. So yeah, we have provided, I think, the same level of guidance that's publicly available to industry, to AOs, and they obviously have the ability to come to us and ask questions. As does industry, if they have concerns about their scope, we're always willing to help. But I think long-term, moving towards something like GMDM is going to help everyone with the clarity in what products are in or out. So that'll be coming at some point in the future.
Can I just add to that?
Absolutely.
And I think we work very closely with Health Canada. If you have terminology that they've given you that they would be expecting in it, just going, I think it was Colin yesterday was saying, but your rationales for why these product classes or why these product categories or why, you know, this specificity versus the broader category helps us, again, come a very long way in helping get those scopes developed for you. As Health Canada is the main user of the certificate itself, while the other regulators usually use the report, we are more than willing to work with what terminology they're looking at, since the reports do go into the much grainier detail of the products themselves for the other regulators. So I think it's definitely a back and forth between all three of us, and the manufacturers, the AOs, and the regulators, and we're always willing to you know, hear that feedback and work with you to get a scope that will meet all of our needs.
Speaking of manufacturers, I have a question for Rajay. How do you recommend that small and mid-sized companies balance the need for the regulatory compliance under MDSAP with the imperative to innovate rapidly?
Oh, innovative medical device companies, I would definitely recommend them to start thinking about quality and regulatory strategy as soon as they start thinking about their designs. So it's when they start it, like they have to think about different jurisdictions, how they are planning, and then do it by phase approach, so they can utilize the MDSAP in a better way, rather than just blindly going into one market, then realizing, oh my God, I have to do MDSAP, and then change the certificate, and timelines get extended. So it's better to think as early as you think about your device design, start thinking about where to go, how you want to do it, and keep your quality system very simple, straightforward. Thank you.
All right. I think I have a question from the audience.
It's on? Good. Ken Pilgrim, Emergo by UL. To follow up for Frederick and Morgan on the how long does it take to get MDSAP certification. So one thing that's been very helpful, and we help companies come to market on both quality and regulatory aspects. One thing that's been very helpful in the EU has been the market surveys that notified bodies have put out, which give, you know, rolling timelines on how long it takes to get both a quality system and product certification. Is there any initiative to do the same thing for MDSAP, especially if you're going to be adding new members, which is going to add challenges for both resources for companies and for the auditing organizations?
So that's not something we've discussed in terms of, you know, publicizing that information. Certainly as a regulator, what we've often said to companies is when you're looking for market access, you're looking for an AO or registrar. I've said it before, it's a competitive industry up to a certain amount, and there's a benefit to see different AOs provide a different level of service, different products, and it pays to, well, I shouldn't say it pays, but there's value in looking around to see, because different AOs have different specialties and different strengths. Some of them are very, very quick, but they have, you know, more restricted scopes and things like that. So we've tried not to meddle too much in the commercial aspect of the program as regulators, and to let the business side do its thing, because we don't want to give any sort of inclination that there's some sort of cartel or anything like that being put in place, right? And so we're not necessarily tackling that business side of it. But I see the value, as you're saying, as someone looking to enter the market, to say, hey, is there somewhere I can look to see who can get me there the fastest? Who's got the most capacity? But I don't know that that's something we're looking at right now.
Well, the notified body surveys were a pretty broad perspective, but, you know, they were quite helpful in informing companies, look, you know, I think one of the more recent, 13 months minimum for a quality management system certification under, you know, for the MDR, IVDR. But also it gave information on what were the main challenges, you know, incomplete submissions and so on. So might be something to consider. That could help industry plan for market entry for MDC when they needed MDSAP.
That's thank you.
All right, I see that we have a couple more questions on Slido. What would be required for Health Canada to grant a 3 to 5 year conditional device license to manufacturers who are new to Canada?
It would require us to have such a pathway to be able to offer that. There's absolutely nothing in our regulations right now that even would consider that. So without that in place, I don't know how we would ever be able to do that, unfortunately.
Fair enough. We heard yesterday that device licensing recommended to use GMDN codes in scope of devices, but in general, AOs have more broader device types. Please discuss the preference.
So the current guidance that at least I've given my team and BSI as a whole is based on the MDSAP program document, so that certificate document requirements. So that is where we're currently working. Obviously, as Fred has already alluded, we've talked about GMDN codes and things like that, and scope statements, and updating our internal documents. The policy documents are what we stand on currently, kind of as our fallback backbone, but I don't think that we're necessarily opposed to some of the terminology of GMDN. It's just, it's again, finding that balance of the specificity. You can't just have a scope of implants. That's a bit too broad. Non-active implants is a very broad scope. So how close do we get down? Because there was even talk, I know in BSI about scope statements being based on like the main technical areas, and that's too broad because that could cover many things. So it's just finding that balance, and I know that we're definitely willing to work in both directions, but we're trying to meet the requirements of what is currently in the policy documents for the program.
Yeah, I think the challenge, and as Colin spoke to yesterday, it's really trying to establish that link between the application product and that scope of certification, and recognizing that for some companies, very, very large, like multinational companies, they are like thousands of catalog numbers, right? Catalog items. And we don't want to have a scope statement that spans multiple pages. So it's really trying to find that balance. We're not so against using broader terms when in fact everything below that broader term is captured. Right? It's when you use a broad term and there's only one very tiny specific portion of it that you're actually doing. That's where it becomes a bit more challenging. So as I said, we're trying to move towards more of a GMDN nomenclature and coding with the right level of specificity. And I think that long term is going to do away with a lot of this these irritants of scopes and matching and things like that, because I understand it's annoying having to go back and get your scope changed and things like that. So hopefully this will allow us to just bypass the whole thing. Fingers crossed.
All right. Next question is, please elaborate on not being able to opt out of other jurisdictions if you hold an MDSAP cert for Canada. Is that an MDSAP regulatory requirement?
Yeah, that's something that's been in the program since the start. This was sort of conditional to all the founding members going in, because if you create the ability to sort of carve out jurisdictions, then it doesn't bring anything to the other countries to participate in the program, to put resources in the program. And also it doesn't, I don't want to say it looks like you're hiding something, but why don't you want this particular aspect to be looked at, particularly when, for instance, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to look at the US requirements. Well, why not? I mean, you're there. It's not a huge difference time-wise. And it also means that you're not going to be subject to routine FDA inspections. And so, yeah, that was a requirement we put in very early on. I don't know that it's super well documented, unfortunately. But definitely that is the way the system is set up. Because what we're looking at is a management system that covers your operations, right? Your management system covers your operations, whether that product ends up in the US or Canada. There's slightly different regulatory requirements, but the core of it is the same. So how do you separate that out is a bit trickier. And that's why we just said, if you're in, you're in.
All right.
I was just going to add one thing. That doesn't mean if you are not selling or planning to sell in one of those jurisdictions, you are allowed to opt out of those. But if you are selling or planning to sell, that's when they're mandatory. So just a little clarifier on that.
Yeah, maybe that wasn't clear. It's only obligatory if you're actively selling in that market, right? If you're planning to sell, well, you probably want to do it now beforehand. But if you're not selling in Australia, you don't plan on selling in Australia, you don't have to worry about Australian requirements.
All right, I think that's it for our time. So I want to thank all the speakers. It was a pleasure working with you on this session. If there are any unanswered questions for Fred, they will be forwarded to be addressed during the last session for Ask Health Canada. So please don't forget to ask your questions and get them in early for that session.